There's no genre that can make you feel alive quite like the best horror games can. Sure, FPS games can provide some high-speed, furious action, and open-world games may take your breath away when you gaze upon a new horizon, but there's nothing close to the feeling from playing the best horror games to remind you of your mortality, whether that's through creeping tension or some loud and proud jump scares. Just like their movie counterparts, horror games tend to attract a more niche audience, but one that's still pretty sizable. There's a reason why so many horror titles can be found on Steam. Any chance players can get to feel their hearts fall out of their backsides, and they will take it. To remind the industry of what good can come from spending money on producing stuff people actually want, we've compiled a list of the scariest horror games that are sure to spook you rotten. Bear in mind that any games listed for PS4 and Xbox One will also work on PS5 and Xbox S and X respectively, thanks to backwards compatibility. And before we get into this chunky boy list, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell for even more from the Cultured Vultures YouTube channel. Duh. 50. Slender, The Arrival. Everyone is sick to the back teeth of Slender Man, with Hollywood grinding away just about any fear of him remaining thanks to the disastrous adaptation from 2018. Slender is also guilty of inspiring many half-arsed imitators. They don't tend to imitate something that isn't fantastic. Heavily reliant on jump scares, Slender The Arrival also has a creeping tension throughout thanks to excellent audio design. A sequence in an underground bunker with a hooded assailant, and also Slender himself to contend with, is pure torture on the nerves. The game loses its effectiveness somewhat after that, but it's still a deeply unsettling experience. 49. Five Nights at Freddy's. While there's no denying that the 17 sequels that followed ruined a lot of the magic for Five Nights at Freddy's, the first game in the franchise is still a laser-focused jump-scare simulator that often succeeds at robbing you of your nerve. You play as a new security guy at a creepy place for kids by the name of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Trouble is, the animatronics come to life at night, leaving you desperately swiveling from side to side to make sure they can't get in while also balancing electricity levels. It's not one for those who can't multitask. 48. Penumbra Overture. Penumbra Overture is almost always overlooked when it comes to discussing the best horror games ever made. Maybe it's down to its younger brother, Amnesia, stealing all of the acclaim, or it just not reaching enough people, but Penumbra Overture is almost always left out of the conversation. The first in a string of episodic games, Overture follows a physicist dealing with loss who finds himself in Greenland at the behest of a mysterious letter. Curiously, for a frictional game, there is combat, though it's definitely a little rough around the edges. Still, the spooks are solid and it has plenty of follow-up chapters to dive into if you're feeling chilly. 47. Among the Sleep. We're at our most vulnerable when we're young, what with us not being able to say sentences that well and having a weird squishy bit on our skulls and all. Among the Sleep pitches an unusual scenario for a horror game. You play as a young baby who ventures out of their cot and into a nightmare. But is it really as simple as that? Such an interesting premise is backed by some solid, mostly PG scares built on suspense and a story that keeps going places you wouldn't expect. There's also a bear who tries to guide you through the nightmare, so that's another tick for Among the Sleep. 46. Hunt Showdown. A battle royale-esque game with disturbing elements may not feel like a great fit here, but just try playing it in the dark solo with a chunky pair of headphones and watch how often you twitch at every little bit of audio design in Hunt Showdown. The audio design in this game is designed to make you question everything. It's good that Hunt has the creatures to back up the things that go bump in the night then, featuring twisted designs such as a woman with a severely broken neck who shoots out poisonous bugs, and the scariest spider in a game since Limbo, and a superbly southern gothic aesthetic. We dare you to get little Timmy to play this instead of Fortnite and see if he still keeps going on about V-Bucks afterwards. He probably won't be able to do much of anything, actually. 45. Outlast 2. While not quite as concentrated as the original game, Outlast 2 still has plenty of scares and blood-pumping chase sequences to induce a heart attack to offer. Our resting heart rate still hasn't recovered from that cursed sawmill level. Just like the first game, you take control of a defenseless protagonist armed with nothing but a camera as a bunch of lunatics seek you out in the dark. You have to find your missing wife who is deep within a cult in Arizona, one cornfield at a time. The trial and error nature gives you some reprieve from the scares and kills the tension somewhat, but nobody forgets the first time they met Nick and Laird. 44. Clock Tower. The world of horror owes a debt of gratitude to Clock Tower, one of the originators of survival horror that started brightly before unfortunately dimming the longer it continued. A 3D sequel to Clock Tower, confusingly itself called Clock Tower, lost a lot of the magic of 2D point and click. The series has been up and down ever since, it very much at a down right now with it being dormant since the early 2000s. It's a shame, because the original game in which you must solve puzzles while being hunted by Scissor Man still has plenty to offer. Sure, it's not as scary as most modern games, but this Argento-inspired horror has proved influential for a reason. 43. Dino Crisis. Only a mind like Shinji Mikami could sit down at a drawing board and think, Resident Evil, but dinosaurs. Following the rampant success of the zombie series and the popularity of Jurassic Park, he set to work on making a survival horror with his own bonkers touch. Following Swort's deployment to a remote research facility, they soon discover that a reportedly dead scientist isn't dead at all and has actually been creating velociraptors and T-Rex, as you do. Featuring classic tank controls and fright, Dino Crisis spawned a more action-orientated sequel and a third entry that we just don't talk about. With fans pining for a fourth game in the series, a new Dino Crisis feels like it would just print money. 42. Layers of Fear 2. Almost a surprise release, Layers of Fear 2 was somewhat overlooked during the course of 2019, with even the booming voice of Tony Todd not helping it stand out among the crowd. It's a shame because it offers a lot of improvements over the original, and you might even argue that it's scarier at a few points. Certainly a more visually ambitious horror, Layers of Fear 2 transports you aboard a cruise ship with a disturbing story revolving around a sibling pair of stowaways. It's not going to be as straightforward as it sounds. A love letter to the golden age of Hollywood, there are plenty of layers to this one, especially with the option to find multiple endings. 41. Devotion. The wild controversy surrounding Devotion has unfortunately meant that the game itself has been somewhat forgotten, not helped by the fact that it's no longer for sale on somewhere like Steam. It's a crying shame that such a small detail could end up derailing an entire studio and stop so many potential fans from experiencing a true horror gem. Red Candle's first 3D game following the also excellent Detention, this Taiwanese production follows a family as they relive the stages of their lives in a creepy apartment complex before going to unexpected places. Low on scares, Devotion is a masterclass in how to build bubbling tension and storytelling that really deserves to see the light of day again in a big way. Here's hoping it now being relisted gives it a second chance. 40. Manhunt. One of the most controversial games ever made, and for good reason. Manhunt went for shock value when it released in the PS2 era, and it certainly made the headlines it craved. Finding itself banned from release in certain countries, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre of video games is a horror game where the real monster is its hero. You play as James Earl Cash, who's sentenced to a sick game of life or death in Carcer City. Sneaking your way around its gang-infested areas, you must survive any way you see fit, including suffocation by plastic bag, and that's one of the game's most PG moments. Dark as they come, Manhunt is a visceral game that ruined the youths of many, though it might not quite have the same effect these days. 39. Observer. A cyberpunk horror game, Observer is the most recent effort from the mind warpers over at Bloober Team, who are also responsible for the equally chilling Layers of Fear. Set in the near future, you play as the titular Observer as he jacks into the minds of criminal suspects. Like a twisted version of Minority Report, Observer doesn't flinch away from taking you to the darkest recesses of the human mind. You can expect the places you visit to be as twisted as the criminals themselves. Featuring a surprisingly committed performance from the late Rutger Hauer and the unforgivable visuals that Bloober are becoming notorious for, Observer is a game you should plug yourself into if you haven't yet. 38. Dead by Daylight. We had to choose between this or Friday the 13th, the game, to be higher up, but with the latter's current stick spot regarding licensing, we went with the multiplayer horror game with some stability. Dead by Daylight may also arguably be the better of the two anyway, thanks to its wider cast of murderers. Teamwork is key in Dead by Daylight as you work to power generators to escape a massive but also somehow claustrophobic map. On the flip side, you can play as a killer and hunt other players down and even hang them on hooks for a sacrifice. If that isn't the most metal sounding game ever, we don't know what is. 37. Silent Hill 4: The Room. Arguably the last great Silent Hill game, The Room represented a pretty big change in formula for the franchise, so much so that it doesn't even take place in Silent Hill itself. Instead, you play as Henry Townsend as he tries to escape his apartment while stumbling into supernatural worlds. With the action in the eponymous room taking place in first person and less obscure puzzles to tackle, Silent Hill 4 was a significant departure to a less demanding experience, though the scares from the first 3 games were certainly still present. Definitely one of the most underappreciated big horror games ever. 36. SIREN: Blood Curse. Probably the most abstract entry on this list, SIREN: Blood Curse is a PS3 title that didn't get much of a look in the West. It might be down to it treading a fine line between the bizarre and innovative thanks to the sight jack system, which allows you to see from the perspective of your attackers. Those attackers take the form of deranged villagers who have become the victims of a curse, with you playing as a cast of hapless TV crew members. You unfurl the mystery as time goes on, as well as learn how to get to grips with these slightly odd controls. It's a tough experience and one that may annoy with its trial and error approach, but SIREN: Blood Curse's oppressive mood and constant twists will keep you hooked. 35. Resident Evil: Village. Resident Evil Village would have been a big hit because of its suitably big vampire lady, regardless of whether the game was any good or not. Luckily, Capcom provided by the meat to go with the thirst. Coming across like a mixture of the 4th and 7th Resident Evil games, Village picks up the baton left by 7 and sprinkles some more action on top. Add in some light hunting, a rotund merchant who's hard not to love, and the customarily bonkers storyline for a Resident Evil game, and you get a sequel that leaves it all out on the floor. Sure, the final third veers close towards boulder punching levels of nonsense, but it's also just about the most Resident Evil thing we've ever seen. 34. Fatal Frame 2: Crimson Butterfly. Another horror game that's not what you would call conventional, Fatal Frame 2 has become a cult classic and often agreed upon as the best in the franchise. A slightly more accessible game than its predecessor, it tasks you with taking photographs of ghosts, which should be enough to sell you all on its own. While the passage of time has dulled the effectiveness of some of its scares, Fatal Frame 2 still consistently fosters a sense of unease and an almost unwillingness to look through the camera to see which nightmares await you next. It's been too long since the last Fatal Frame game. 33. The Suffering. Not quite so much an out-and-out horror with scares a minute, The Suffering favours action by tasking you with killing some of the most deformed and unforgettable creatures ever depicted in a video game. It's almost been a decade and a half and the needle-eye guys still creep into our nightmares. You play as Talk, a criminal locked up in Abbott State Penitentiary when all manner of supernatural madness is unleashed. With a healthy supply of weaponry and Talk able to call upon his inner demons for a more powerful form, The Suffering is more of a body horror and one that still holds up well to this day. You may have to track down an old PS2 or Xbox copy, as this brilliant series has sadly not had the remaster treatment. 32. The Thing. The definition of a cult classic, The Thing is one of the most beloved movie adaptations for a reason. It picks up exactly where John Carpenter left off, with you encountering the things and all the paranoia that they bring among your squad mates. The Thing should really be looked back on as a majorly innovative and pioneering horror game, featuring multiple perspectives, utilising the fear of your squad to change the way they perform, and also your friends possibly being infected with the Thing. It's a testing and stressful horror that we would not mind being remade. 31. Silent Hill 3. It was always going to be hard for Konami to follow Silent Hill 2, and the third entry in the series doesn't take a huge amount of risks to deviate from what was previously so successful. It's still completely malevolent and full of imagery that would likely make even the guys at Troma wince. You play as Heather Mason, the daughter of the protagonist from the first game, as she becomes embroiled in the machinations of a cult. Silent Hill 3 leans into its aesthetic more than its prequels, with a constant monochrome sheen to the game, giving it a gritty style that somehow makes it that bit more gruesome. 30. Until Dawn. A horror game so successful that Sony commissioned Supermassive to take on more projects than they could feasibly handle. Until Dawn takes the tried and tested formula of old slashers and gives it a shot of 21st century cynicism right in the arm. If you loved Scream, there's a good chance you'll also appreciate Until Dawn. One of the most hands-off entries on this list, Until Dawn focuses on crafting a customizable narrative and making tough decisions more than it does gameplay. There's still real tension to be had though, even if you aren't directly in control of everything. If one of the game's many obnoxious characters dies, that's it, they're gone for good. With stakes like those as well as some gorgeous visuals, it's no wonder that Until Dawn is one of the PS4's best exclusives. 29. DARKWOOD. It takes something really special to make a top-down game feel terrifying, especially when you can't see all the little details of the things that go bump in the night. Thanks to a hauntingly muted aesthetic and some truly twisted design, DARKWOOD manages to create more scares than other games with many more times the budget. A survival game with an open approach to how you play, DARKWOOD features a suitably dark and mysterious storyline that twists depending on how you approach other survivors. At day, you must scavenge all you can before the night comes, which, well, is not for the faint of heart. Thanks to some deeply unnerving audio and a mostly show-don't-tell ethos, DARKWOOD is a lo-fi horror that's high on giving you a heart attack. 28. Little Nightmares. A little girl in a yellow jacket aboard a ship full of warped passengers. That's the long and short of it with Little Nightmares, and while the experience itself is a short one, it's a journey that you won't be able to shake for far longer. Mechanically a puzzle platformer, Little Nightmares pits you as Six as she seeks to evade the clutches of barely human creatures whose designs are memorable enough to keep you pushing on to see what's next. Aardman meets Tim Burton as aberrations chase you down, you feeling utterly helpless to defend yourself before the true nature of the ship is revealed in grotesque fashion. 27. Detention. Taking place in Taiwan during the reign of an oppressive government, Detention isn't really like the other horror games on this list. Not only does it double act as a thoroughly unsettling horror experience, as well as a heartbreaking parable of the region at that time, it's also considerably lo-fi compared to its peers. You don't need a detailed 3D monster to jump through a window at you to feel ill at ease. With a typhoon approaching her school, a young girl must venture her way around its creepy halls to save her friends while fending off the monsters that lurk. Hiding is the obvious ploy, but some of the monsters just want an offering to leave you alone. While it's probably not the scariest game here, its varied puzzles and fascinating subject matter make Detention one of the most unique. 26. Resident Evil 4. You may balk at Resident Evil 4 being so low, or even this high, depending on how you feel about its change in direction on our list. With it favouring action over the survival elements of the first 3 games, it's more of a tense affair than the straightforward bedwetting we've been accustomed to from the Resident Evil franchise, though they can put the progenitors back where they came from, thanks. You play as Leon, who is sent on a mission to a village in Spain to recover the president's daughter. It's clearly not going to be easy, as picking her up in a Ford Focus and driving off into the sunset. That becomes pretty clear when the first villager sprouts tentacles out of the neck hole you just created with your shotgun. 25. Silent Hill 1. The very first Silent Hill game is habitually overlooked for its flashier and more technically impressive cousins, with its sequel in particular getting a lot of the limelight. While it may look increasingly ropey with every passing year, the original Silent Hill is still worth seeking out for its execution of an incredibly twisted and brilliant vision. Created after Konami failed to get the rights to an adaptation of Stephen King's The Mist, Silent Hill was unlike anything else out there when it released in 1999. Take control of Harry Mason on the search for his missing daughter as he slowly loses control in the eponymous town with all manner of wretched creatures lurking around every corner. If you're talking about the most influential horror games of all time, Silent Hill ought to be near the top of that list. 24. Resident Evil 3. While the weakest of the original trilogy, the third game still has plenty of frights to offer, mainly due to one ugly giant in a trench coat with a one-track mind. In what wasn't even intended to be a new mainline game in the series, you play as Jill Valentine as she is stalked through the streets of Raccoon City by Nemesis, an almost invincible Umbrella creation with some loose ends to tie up as the plot moves parallel to the second game. Featuring some innovative player choice, smoother movement and randomised puzzling, Resi 3 didn't quite have the same impact as its predecessors, and they kind of missed the chance to make it even better with its remake. Still, old Nemi will always hurt your feelings. 23. The Forest. While you may try and fail to argue that The Forest isn't a horror game as it's more closely tied to a survival experience than anything, you try descending into the darkness for the first time and then try to stick to your story. Tottering around in the forest's underground caverns with barely any light made us never want to go spelunking. Things aren't that much better on the surface either. Cannibalistic natives stalk you at seemingly every turn. You may think you're safe, but they're probably watching you more than you know. Worse still, trying to defend yourself just brings on even bigger and more hideous abominations, so the best option may in fact just be to run away like a coward. We won't judge. 22. Inside. Speaking of defenseless children, Playdead have certainly carved out a niche for themselves with Inside and the earlier Limbo. While Limbo itself is a tense and challenging affair, Inside's fuller world and more robust visuals bring its horrors to life. It's not a jump scare factory, rather that the game has a pervasive sense of dread that never really dissipates. Much like Little Nightmares, itself arguably inspired by Playdead's output, Inside tasks you with completing some less than obvious puzzles to escape capture and to unfurl its slow but steady world building. However, Inside differentiates itself by allowing the player to take control of the drones who are victims of inhuman experiments. It's a seriously grim game, evidenced by the first time you watch a young boy being forcefully drowned. 21. Fear. One of the most frenetic horror games on this list, Monolith's F.E.A.R, First Encounter Assault Recon if you're feeling particular, is not so much about the hiding and cowering as it is the exploding and murdering. An FPS game with a horror flavour, F.E.A.R's brand is one that feels unique and, importantly, scary. While it may lean on jump scares too much sometimes, it's hard to deny the efficiency of a creepy little girl at making pants turn a decidedly darker colour. Alma is always waiting to bring the terror, most infamously right at the top of a ladder. The latter two games in the F.E.A.R trilogy are also good, but for keeping things relatively simple, the original game provides the biggest scares. 20. Dead Rising. Legend says that no list of the best horror games is complete without an entry that allows you to plop a Servbot helmet on top of a zombie. Dead Rising may not offer conventional scares in the sense that the undead aren't all that threatening, but what it does provide is a constant state of unease with the clock ticking away. Losing time to do what you need to do around the Willamette Park View Mall is the real horror of Dead Rising, meaning that you have to constantly be watching the clock. Thanks to a save system that we've all now retrospectively agreed is terrible, death in Dead Rising can be a real killer, adding to the stakes. The second game of the franchise, Off the Record in particular, offers similar fun. 19. Condemned Criminal Origins. Monolith was certainly on a tear with their horror output last generation, with Condemned bringing some more traditional scares compared to F.E.A.R and its constant action. Something of a cult classic, Condemned is a franchise that's always in demand for another entry by those who know what everyone else is missing out on. Banned in Germany as a result of its brutality, Condemned is a first-person couch clencher that doesn't shy away from showing the depravities of humanity. Playing as Ethan Thomas, he must track down a serial killer while fending off the twisted minds of Metro City. It's tense, unflinching, and like all good survival horror games, never makes survival feel like an easy feat. 18. The Evil Within 2. One of 2017's most severely underrated games, The Evil Within 2 takes some of the unnecessary baggage and strange mechanics from the original game and streamlines the experience to great effect. While it could be argued that the first game is scarier, there's nothing like stalking around a demented town as a zombie-like creature stalks their way across the streets. Aesthetically, The Evil Within 2 is a complete screenshot factory. It nails what would lie in the darkest recesses of a mind and throws up more than a few memorable monsters in the process. While it may be hammy at some points, it's a far leaner affair than the one that polarised so many in the original game, and a more consistent and terrifying descent into darkness as a result. You can even play in first person, just in case the terror isn't terrifying enough already. 17. Layers of Fear. Speaking of descents, Layers of Fear shows the disintegration of the psyche perfectly with you playing as a painter who is deep in denial. While its gameplay may be somewhat on the basic side, where Layers of Fear really shines is in its constantly shifting world and head-spinning twists. You can enter one room 1 second and be transported to something far more nefarious the next. The environments reflect the way the protagonist is spiralling. As the game continues and the mystery unspools, so too does his grasp on reality. An innocuous painting on an easel morphs into something completely hideous over time, which is reflected in the mansion as things continue to not appear as they seem. Not one to play if you're riding high on drugs, that's for damn sure. 16. Outlast. Outlast was a shot in the arm for the indie horror scene when it released back in 2013, mainly because it was something original and not just another diluted Slender Man clone. Instead, it threw you into an insane asylum as a journalist armed with only a camera and an affinity for lockers. To say that Outlast goes for the jugular would be an understatement. The jump scares are effective, but wholly earned with the mystery behind the asylum itself driving things forward. Featuring some of the most memorable set pieces in horror game history, finger food, anyone, and 1 or 2 genitals, Outlast is an undeniable horror classic that kick-started a new wave for the genre. 15. System Shock 2. Few games have proven as influential as System Shock 2, its blend of first-person action with RPG elements and a nice helping of horror making it go down as a bona fide cult classic. Games like Prey, Dead Space and BIOSHOCK owe a lot to System Shock, the latter the most as its spiritual successor. Set aboard a spaceship ravaged by a genetic infection, you play as a soldier with amnesia who walks a twisty path to uncover the truth about what went down. Boasting some of the most distinctive creature designs for its time and a blend of mechanics that still entice today, System Shock 2's lack of commercial success has meant that not near enough people appreciate it for the masterpiece it is. 14. Dead Space. While some may argue that the second entry is overall the better game, the original Dead Space delivers the better scares due to just how vulnerable Isaac feels as he traipses his way around the spaceship infested with nightmarish necromorphs. The early goings are particularly tough, equipping you with just a bare bones plasma cutter to take on abominations in their hordes. Where Dead Space comes into its own is how it approaches combat. Shooting limbs off these spindly bastards who want to eat your neck off is the only way to slow them down, but how do you fend off a rampaging rhino creature? Nobody will ever be able to forget their first sobering trip aboard the USG Ishimura, and with a remake recently announced, it's time to suit up and take on necromorphs once again. 13. S.T.A.L.K.E.R. Call of Pripyat. It's strange that Chernobyl as a setting has been so ineffectively explored in movies over the years. Leave it to video games to fill the gap then. The S.T.A.L.K.E.R. franchise has done more than enough to bring the creep factor up to 11 in one of the most unnerving places on the planet, with Call of Pripyat arguably representing the series at its peak. You play as Agent Alexander Diktarov, who travels to an irradiated zone to search for missing helicopters and discovers far more than he bargained for in the process. With a sense of depth that is so sorely missing from its modern peers and that all-important scare factor as deformed creatures appropriately stalk you, Call of Pripyat is held up as an example of superb game design all these years later for good reason. 12. BIOSHOCK. You may be thinking to yourself that BIOSHOCK doesn't really deserve a spot on this list as it isn't certifiably horror. So did we. That is until we went back and played it for the first time in a decade and rediscovered a fear that must have been so unnerving that it was shaken from our memories forever. Rapture is such a beautiful world filled with so much ugliness. Granted, some of the scares are nullified by how overpowered you eventually become, but there's no taking away from the first time you innocuously turn around in the doctor's surgery and find yourself staring into the eyes of a rogue splicer, or when you hear the maniacal laughter of an unseen and demented aristocrat just waiting to leap on you. For a truly horrifying experience, try playing it on the hardest difficulty without using a Vita chamber. 11. Dying Light. It's become a bit of a running gag here at Cultured Vultures that Dying Light somehow always manages to find its way onto our lists. That's not a coincidence, and neither is it due to us being slipped money under the table, although we probably wouldn't say no to a small loan of $1 million, is it? No, Dying Light keeps cropping up here because it's just a good horror game and one more people should play, especially with its sequel in sight. While slowly shuffling zombies may have lost some of their fear factor over the years, Dying Light at night is when the game is at its most terrifying. A thrilling game of cat and mouse between you and the deadly virals unfolds as you desperately try to find safety. While they're less of a death sentence the higher the level you are, the first 10 or so hours of Dying Light's nightmares are sure to get palms sweating. 10. Alien Isolation. Colonial Marines and Isolation are on the complete opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to how to adapt an iconic license. Isolation nails the feeling of the first Alien movie, pitting you as Ripley's daughter as a xenomorph diligently stalks you throughout a desolate spaceship. Unless you can find a flamethrower, the xenomorph simply spotting you means it's curtains. Your cause isn't helped by the antagonist having an adaptive AI, one that changes its ways and learns from what you do as you continue to escape its claws, sword tail and weird mouth thing. It's constantly nerve-wracking with you looking over your shoulder every other second. Even air ducts don't grant you a certain respite. Isolation is available on the cheap these days, though if you want to get the most out of it, you have to also pick up the Crew Expendable DLC, which perfectly encapsulates the first Alien movie. 9. SOMA. The first entry from Frictional in our rundown of the best horrors, but not the last. SOMA is an ugly yet somehow also beautiful descent into the deep blue of the ocean. When you wake up in an isolated underwater base without a memory of how you arrived there, the desire to uncover its captivating story is what will keep you going no matter how many times you encounter something that very much wants you dead. A pacifist adventure, you are ill-equipped to deal with the monstrosities that Pathos 2 throws away and must instead solve puzzles to make progress. Above the scares, of which there are many, the main hook of persevering through SOMA is its narrative. Frictional were kind enough to even patch in an update that allowed players to explore at their liberty without any enemies, just in case you're all at sea, when it comes to jump scares. 8. Left 4 Dead 2. What more can be said about the simple joy of teaming up with friends or random obsessives online in Left 4 Dead 2? There's a reason why it's still going strong long after Valve forgot how to do basic numeracy. It's because it's a solid, easy to play FPS game as well as being a surprisingly scary horror game at points. We are of course speaking specifically about the moments featuring the witch, her cries of pain letting you know that your own pain is incoming. After all these years, the AI director is still a marvel, meaning that no two runs are exactly the same. Once you think you're safe, here comes the sadomasochistic AI to ruin your day. 7. Resident Evil 7. Polarizing as its switch to a first-person perspective might have been, it allowed Resident Evil to become something that it hadn't been for its last couple of iterations, an out-and-out horror game. By returning the franchise to the conventions that made it so loved to begin with, Resident Evil 7 re-energized a series that was looking leggy. You don't forget the first time Jack Baker comes crashing through the wall. Playing as Lucas, a regular guy on the hunt for his missing wife, you're transported to the bayou where the sick and twisted Baker family lies in wait for you. With a claustrophobic feel and limited resources, Resident Evil 7 brings the evil back to the Resi name with the Bakers hell-bent on maiming and or killing you any way they can. You'll soon discover that includes cutting you in half with a chainsaw, trapping you in Saw-esque games, and subjecting you to a terrible interior decor. 6. Eternal Darkness, SANITY'S Requiem. Away from the likes of Super Mario Sunshine and Billy Hatcher, iconic game by the way, the GameCube actually had quite the dark side. The rather suitably named Eternal Darkness, SANITY'S Requiem, was one such game that showed that Nintendo wasn't just for kids, who probably would have gone insane themselves if they played such a twisted and macabre game. Sanity mechanics are nothing new these days, but back in 2002, they were revolutionary. Eternal Darkness's approach to a dissolving psyche looked to directly mess with the player themselves, going as far as smashing the fourth wall down and gleefully jiggling atop the rubble. While it may be a little rough around the edges for modern horror fans, Eternal Darkness is still worth seeking out by anyone who wants to get a bit crazy. One of the best horror games on any Nintendo console ever. The real horror, however, may be how dramatically Silicon Knights fell from grace. 5. Resident Evil 2, 2019. We had to think long and hard about whether or not we wanted the original Resident Evil 2 or the remake to land a spot on our list. There's no doubting the legacy and importance of the first go around, but the remake delivers a faithful twist on the classic while also bringing a few of its own original ideas to the table. Beautiful to look at, if you dare, the gore can be quite brutally detailed and handles like a dream. Resident Evil 2 from 2019 is everything you should look for in a remake. It's respectful of its origins and also not afraid to take some risks by remixing its story. It remixes an almost untouchable icon to deliver an arguably even better game, as well as coming packaged to the gills with content. just remember to keep an eye on the ceilings. 4. The Last of Us. Whether it's the heart-pumping escape from the sudden apocalypse or creeping around dilapidated buildings with nothing but a brick and a couple of bullets to keep you sane, The Last of Us is one of the scariest horror games that's often overlooked as being just that. The relationship at its core is ultimately the main attraction, but you shouldn't overlook the sheer terror of an incoming clicker and the lack of resources with which to fend them off. Joel's neck has been ripped out plenty of times in plenty of playthroughs. These encounters with the clickers are The Last of Us at its purest in terms of horror. You're too scared to make any noise at all as you stalk around corridors, but the regular zombies can be equally unnerving, especially when they group up. There's also a sequence where you're part submerged as you try to turn the electricity back on that we just don't really want to talk about. 3. Silent Hill 2. It could be argued that Silent Hill 2 created a pedestal that was impossible for any sequels to climb up to. A masterclass in setting a mood and keeping the player engaged, Konami's classic takes you back to the land of eternal fog as James Sunderland, replacing Harry Mason. After receiving a letter from his supposedly dead wife, James falls into a nightmare of his own making. While it features combat, the gameplay of Silent Hill 2 mostly revolves around solving puzzles and discovering details to uncover the mystery at the heart of the cursed town. Even though its visuals are certainly on the polygonal side, that doesn't stop them from being just as disturbing, if not more so than their modern peers. Pyramid Head is just as horrific as he was in 2001. Sadly, if you want to play Silent Hill 2, you may have to dig out the PlayStation 2 as the HD collection is absurdly bad. Number 2. Amnesia: The Dark Descent. The game that inspired a wave of imitators and frictional games' second entry on our list of the essential horror titles. Amnesia: The Dark Descent changed the game for horror by introducing fresh mechanics to coincide with a slow-burning but still captivating story. You and Daniel are in this unending nightmare together, nothing but a lamp in hand and a dream. With Daniel being almost completely defenseless, running into the creatures of the castle is a no-go, though you can't depend on darkness either. Being in it for too long will deplete Daniel's sanity as he gives in to his fears, so you may have to be brave in Amnesia no matter how difficult it might be. There's one sequence in The Dark Descent that may just be the scariest in any horror game ever. We won't spoil it here for the uninitiated, but we will leave you with 2 words: Splish Splash. A true horror classic. And finally at number 1, it's Resident Evil GameCube Remake. We arrive at the zenith of our countdown with a title that was probably the first of its kind for an entire generation. While efforts like Alone in the Dark and Clock Tower may have arrived on the scene first, the original Resident Evil was the one to really bring horror into the public eye. Countless games and spin-offs later, with even an entirely different franchise being spun off from it, it's fair to say that Resident Evil's legacy is not up for debate. However, 2 decades can make even the most polished of diamonds look a little rough, which is why you should seek out the masterful GameCube remake, which has since been ported to every subsequent generation. The Spencer Mansion may still be static, but it's certainly not dead, its corridors bristling with zombies and even more malformed creatures, as well as iconic puzzles that couldn't be more charmingly obtuse if they tried. A masterful remake for the progenitor of the modern horror genre in gaming as we know it. And there you have it. There is our list of the 50 best horror games of all time. Did you agree with the list? Is there anything you would have added that you felt that we missed out? Is there any titles you would have moved around in the list? We're very eager to hear your thoughts on this one, so please do let us know what you're thinking just down below there in the comments section. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please do consider hitting the like button. A lot of time and effort went into this one. We're very happy with how it's come out. So please show a little love to the Vultures, because for me, my throat is on fire. Also subscribe to the channel if you so please, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any content coming right here to the Cultured Vultures YouTube channel. Check out the social medias on screen too, as well as the website culturedvultures.com for even more delicious content. You'll hopefully find many things to your liking in there, and also hopefully we're going to see you in the next one. But until then, good call.